Welcome to the Wide Lens podcast, where expanding your perspective on recent history is our mission. Listen to untold accounts from overlooked voices and see familiar stories in a whole new light. Ready to dive deeper? Let's begin.
Hey folks, welcome to the new episode of the Wide Lens podcast. We're honored to have filmmaker and storyteller Michael Lienau join us. Michael's life, you could say it changed forever on May 18th, 1980, when Mount St. Helens in Washington State in the USA violently erupted. Now, I know this time I had to say USA, and that's because we've got a lot of folks now listening in from all over the world. In fact, every continent. So for folks in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America listening in, it's great having you. So a handful of days after that massive eruption on Mount St. Helens, there was a second eruption that was the second largest eruption in U.S. history. Michael found himself not just documenting history at that point, but surviving it. As one of the few filmmakers who's experienced the magnificent second eruption, Michael's footage became iconic, shaping how the world understood one of the most significant natural disasters in American history. But his story isn't just about being in the wrong place at the right time. It's about courage, instinct, and deep commitment to telling stories that matter. Surviving a deadly ash cloud, Michael's journey is a testament to resilience and the power of storytelling. Today, we'll explore the full arc of that experience, one that lasted days when it should have only been hours, the moments leading up to the eruption, and how that day shaped the rest of his career. We'll also look at the work he's doing now, continuing to elevate stories that help people understand the world through a wider lens. So, Michael, welcome to the Wide Lens podcast. It is an absolute privilege to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Brad. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
It's so good having you. And folks, if you don't know this, Michael is still in Washington, and that's where I'm based too. I'm in the South Sound. He's in the North Sound. So it's a couple hours separating us, but it is just a treat to have you with us, Michael.
Yeah, great to be here to share my story. Thanks, Brad.
Okay, so Michael, we need to start at the beginning. So we want to get back to not just Michael, but we want to get back to little Mikey. I don't know if you had a fun name like that, but we want to get back to when you were a kid. Where did your love for storytelling and filmmaking first take root? How'd that happen?
Well, my grandmother called me Mikey, so she was the only one that did that and got away with it.
Well, this is the second time, I guess.
I guess so. So my love for filmmaking began when I was very young, probably when I was 8 or 9 years old. My mother would make home movies of us kids when we were growing up, and she always had the camera out filming us, whatever we were doing. And then we would watch those movies, and they were terrible because she was always moving the camera. Things were out of focus, but she loved to document us boys growing up. So one day I said, Mom, can I try that with your camera? And she gave me her little Kodak Brownie 8mm camera. And when, I don't know, something jumped inside of me. Something got excited inside of me the moment I touched that camera. Like I wanted to make movies, not home movies, but real movies. So I started filming my brothers and I doing crazy things. And I found a book in our elementary school library called
Hey, Michael, I got to interrupt you. What kind
Yeah.
of crazy stuff would you guys record?
Well, we would do, I found this book in our local library that talked about how to make fun home movies. And in that, they show how to do magic tricks in the camera. And I was already interested in magic tricks. So one thing was I always wanted my little brothers to disappear. So I'd make them disappear. And I made them reappear like on top of roofs and jumping off of roofs and doing crazy stunt things like that. And then we gathered the neighborhood kids in and showed them the movies, and they loved them because they weren't just home movies, but they were actually movies where we were trying to tell a story. And the story I was trying to tell is kind of this mystical, magical world that I was trying to create with my camera. I was trying to be a little mini Walt Disney, I guess. At the time, we were watching Walt Disney a lot. So then this interest grew, and later in elementary school, I had a teacher who heard about this, and she said, "Hey, I'll give you extra credit if you'll write scripts and make movies." So I started doing that with fellow classmates, and then she would actually show the films in the cafeteria at lunchtime. And word got out about this, and it so happens that our local television news station, that was actually an affiliate station of NBC, was looking for a cameraman. They went to the high school and asked if there was any kids interested in filmmaking. They said, no, but there's a kid over in junior high making movies. And by this time, I was about 13 years old. And so one day I got a slip that I had a visitor at the principal's office. And I didn't know if I was in trouble or what was going on, but I got there, and it was this news reporter that I knew of. His name was Larry Barleen. And this was in Southern Oregon, where I grew up. And he said that he was a news reporter, and he was looking for somebody to do cinematography on the news stories that he was covering. And he was not interested in cameras. He didn't know how to use cameras, but he was looking for some kid that could go along with him and do the filming. So he took me over to Medford, Oregon, where I was interviewed by the news director and the assignment editor. And they just asked me some basic questions about cinematography, which I knew. And they gave me a box of film and said, "You're hired. You can be our news stringer for the TV station."
Michael,
Well,
how was that even legal? If you're a 13-year-old boy, what about labor laws back then?
well, I did have the I had the interest from the school, and they were looking for things that kids could do that they were interested in. So they called it a work release program, and they let me go out on assignments, even in the middle of the school day. If there was a breaking news assignment, either Larry or my mother would come to school, pick me up, and drive me to the film assignment. And so I did that all through junior high and high school up until the time that I could get my driver's license. And I would get out of school to go film forest fires or major accidents or whatever was happening. And then I would put the film on the bus, and the bus would deliver the film to the TV station. The TV station would process the 16 millimeter film back in those days, and they would edit the film, and they would be on the news that night. And then after the news director would call me and critique my work. And he actually mentored me for all those years. And there were some major breaking news stories that happened in our small community. Like we would get major wildfires where it would become national news. And on one occasion, we drove in to film a forest fire, and the actual firefighters drove me in to film what they were doing. And we got trapped in the flames, and they had to send in a helicopter to rescue us because we were totally encircled by flames. And that might have been what got my interest in maybe natural disasters, maybe filming events like that. And I also felt behind my lens that I was somewhat invincible, that I was covering other people's news stories, other people's bad news things, which later I didn't realize, but that's what happened to us at Mount St. Helens, quite a few
So,
years later.
so Michael, what's the name of the hometown in Southern Oregon that you grew up in? What was it called?
So I grew up in Klamath Falls, Oregon, and this was a TV station in Medford, Oregon, but they were seen in Klamath Falls, so they wanted to have a story every day from Klamath for their Klamath viewers. So that's what Larry Barleen and I would do. And one of the very first stories that I covered was the United States government's attempt at abolishing Native American tribes. And so we went out to do a story about this one Native American elder who refused to sell his land or to take the money from the government. And here you had these Native American people who had been living in poverty that overnight became millionaires. And it was a total fiasco for the tribe and for the government. But this one Native American, he refused to sell it, saying that the land was his mother, he couldn't sell it. And I was so drawn to his story that I spent almost my entire summer filming him. Now, I was 13 years old when I started filming him. And so every year I filmed the progress of his story and his fight against the United States government. And by the time I was 18 years old, I just graduated from high school and we finished this film. I had another reporter from the TV station I worked at work with me on it. And we finished a documentary and it was on PBS. So a documentary that I started when I was 13, that I finished when I was 18 years old, that told this story about this Native American who stood against the government, and he actually won the case against the government and was able to keep his land. So that really got my interest in telling documentaries and telling true stories.
Were you a bit of an oddity back then as a kid? Because if you think of kids now, everyone's doing selfies. Everyone has the equivalent of an incredible production studio in the palm of their hand with their iPhones or their Androids. But they had to bypass the high school. They had to go to the middle school to find you. Were you unique in the fact that you had such a love for film? And not only that, but for, it sounds like 5 or 6 years or so, you got to really more than dabble in it, but really expand your abilities. Was that unique at that time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It was very unique because I would carry my camera to school every day. I had to, and then either put it in my locker or keep it in my backpack with me. And it was a 16 millimeter Bolex. And it was a crank camera where I had to wind it up and then film it for as long as the crank would last, which was usually long enough for a long shot. But a lot of my high school friends wanted to be in my movies. So we started dreaming up movies, and we started, in all of our spare time, we would make movies. And so it was all about practice and doing that. But the school principal, the school counselors, the school teachers all encouraged this in me. They saw that it was an interest that I had, and they encouraged it. And it was quite an oddity.
Michael,
And to the point to where the fire station even gave me a scanner so that I would know immediately when a breaking story was happening. So I could be at the fire when it was happening, and they had news coverage of it then.
you were Klamath Falls Jimmy Olsen. That's who you were. You really were. It's a little off topic here, but I'm from LeGrand, Oregon, so
Okay.
really similar experience to growing up in Klamath Falls, but just I'm in the northeast corner, and you're in the south of the state. Your city, your town is famous for getting a ton of snow. So much, in fact, that it just piles up on roofs. And I think a lot of the local kids get hired to broom or remove the snow off of roofs because it just gets so heavy. Did you ever have to cover lots of heavy snowfalls in Klamath Falls while you were there?
No, but we moved from Wilmer, Minnesota to Klamath Falls because my father got tired of the snowdrifts in Minnesota, and he did not want to live there any longer. So I'm so thankful that when I was real young, he moved us to Klamath Falls. And to us, the snow was nothing compared to Minnesota. I mean, we still had snow. And my father was a nuclear physicist, and he taught physics at Oregon Institute of Technology. So that was the
Sure.
job that he took, but his specialty was nuclear physics. And the governor of Oregon asked him to lead research and development of geothermal resources, which he gladly took because it was much safer than dealing with nuclear reactors. And he helped develop a program where they put piping under the streets and on sidewalks in downtown Klamath Falls to melt the snow away. And they never had to shovel it or plow it on those streets. And to this day, they still have geothermal energy, which is volcanically related, which may have been part of where my interest in volcanoes came from.
There's lots of tie-ins there, Michael. It's incredible. So how about for you? When did you first start to realize that filmmaking could be more than a hobby, but it could also be your career? I know that as a young man, they're bringing you under the fold of the local station. When did it start clicking to you that like, yeah, I'm known in my school for filmmaking. My friends want to be in my films, but I might be able to actually make a career out of this?
Yeah, so my mother was very creative. She was very musical and kind of wanted me to pursue a career in music, but she encouraged me with filmmaking. In fact, it was her giving me the camera And then when the TV station gave me a box of film, I didn't have a camera. So she drove me from Klamath Falls to Portland to a pawn shop that she found out had 16 millimeter cameras. And she actually gave me a loan to buy that first 16 millimeter camera, which I paid her back from the little tiny bit of money that I made from the TV station. But it was more a mentoring opportunity for me. But my father, being a very practical scientist, he always said, that's a nice hobby, but someday you have to go to school and you have to find a career. So to him, it was a nice hobby, but not a career. And he encouraged me that energy is going to be the future and that I should pursue a career in energy. But I had this passion in my heart to tell stories and to make movies, like the story about the Native American elder. His name was Edison Chiloquin, who refused to sell his land. And, so it wasn't until I graduated from high school and right out of high school, because of the experience I had already stringing TV news, I was offered a job to work full-time in a TV station. So then my dad saw that it was more than a hobby, that it could be a career, and then he was okay with that. He just didn't want to see me get lost in my creative hobby, which so many people do. And so right out of high school, I took the very first job because of the pressure from my dad. Either I needed to go to college and pursue engineering or energy or something, or take this job. And I did not want to work in television news. I wanted to move on from that into telling stories in cinematography, like making movies. So, but I took that job. I worked there for 2 years, was very miserable, telling bad news. That's all you do in television news pretty much, is tell all the bad news. And I decided to make the change and then go to film school. And I was researching film schools when I discovered that something was happening in my backyard. This is in the weather section of the newspaper, mentioned something seismic happening around Mount St. Helens that might lead to something volcanic. It was just a small little article in the paper. But for some reason, something jumped inside of me that was going to become something big, and I needed to be a part of that. And
so when you left Klamath Falls after high school, where did you go? What was the next steps?
Yeah. So when I graduated from high school, there was one of the TV news reporters that I had worked with was looking for a job in a larger market. So he asked me if I want to ride along with him. So we went to Eugene, Oregon, and he interviewed at KVAL TV. It was an NBC affiliate in Eugene, Oregon. And he didn't get the job, but the news director came out to the car and asked me if I'd be interested in interviewing for a job as a news cameraman because they had an opening. And I said, sure. And so he interviewed me, had me shoot a couple of stories, and then he hired me to be their news cameraman. Now, that was quite a jump for me to go from being a freelance news stringer to becoming a full-time staff news photographer and editor. And this was a medium-sized station where we had to shoot and edit our stories. And every night we had to package between 2 to 4 stories. And it was a lot of work and a lot of pressure for, a 17-year-old just graduated from high school. But I did it, and I did it for 2 years. And I was not happy. That was not the career path that I wanted to take. I wasn't interested that much in television news. I had done it up to that point. But, there was a lot of news stories that I covered, and I learned a lot. I think I grew a lot in that time period too, and matured a lot. I learned a lot of things that happen to people in doing television news. So that's when I decided to actually, I had kind of a spiritual experience where, because I was the youngest member of the news crew, I had to do a lot of nighttime shifts where in the middle of the night you get a phone call to go cover something. And there was an ice storm in Eugene, and there were a lot of accidents. There were fatal accidents. And that night I had to go out driving in that, and I was scared, driving in the black ice, accidents everywhere. People had died, and I had to go out and film it and for the news that next day. And so I got back home and I was really tired, and I just I don't want to do this anymore. And I turned on the television And I heard this person talking about this good news network that they were developing where they just wanted to share good news. And I'm like, who is this? And what are they talking about? And it happened to be CBN. And he was starting CBN News. It was Pat Robertson starting CBN News. And I thought, oh, I want to do something like that. And then I kind of forgot about that. And then later after Mount St. Helens, I had a chance to do that. So we talk about that later.
Sounds great. So you're in Eugene, which sadly is the home of the Oregon Ducks. I'm a graduate of Oregon State. Go
Yep.
Bees.
Yep.
And and then is that where you are at, Michael, when the the seismic activity around Mount St. Helens was happening? Because scientists were monitoring it. They knew something was up. They didn't know exactly how the blast was going to occur or how big it was going to be. But were you in Eugene when all of that rumbling was happening?
Nope. I had left Eugene because I was there from 77 and 78. And then 79 or so, I moved back to Klamath Falls, trying to figure out the next steps in my life. And at that point, I was deciding to go to film school to go learn how to make movies. And it wasn't until March of 1980 that I read a small article in the newspaper, a local newspaper, about something seismic happening around Mount St. Helens that might lead to something volcanic. And I was immediately interested, and I knew that I had to be a part of it. So I went up there with my camera right away and started filming some of the the very first early ash and steam eruptions that happened in March of 1980.
So you're now you're up in southern Washington and you are monitoring it. Were there a lot of other folks doing the same thing, or were you one of few people that were recording the activity that was happening?
No, everybody was watching what was happening, because by the time that it actually opened up and started an ash eruption, people were curious, is this volcano going to wake up? Now, only 5 years earlier, Mount Baker had done something very similar where there were ash and steam eruptions, and then it kind of petered out and died down. But Mount St. Helens kept building, one eruption after another, and it kept building. But there's quite a geologic story behind it all. But the more that I observed, and I was able to be escorted in by the Forest Service to get in close, and I filmed some of those early ash and steam eruptions real close, and I sold the footage to network television, and I was hooked. I just wanted to see this thing through. I wanted to see what was going to happen with Mount St. Helens, because it continued to build momentum and energy and drama around the volcano as time went on. So those weeks leading up to May 18th, there was a lot of activity and a lot of discovery for the people around the volcano, and especially the scientists.
And Michael, it is pretty incredible that you were drawn to it and you were able to be a part of that historic moment. Question for you. We're going to start getting right to the eruption, right to the main eruption. But I want to hear from you first, your perspective on this. We've got Michael up there in March, a couple months before the eruption actually happens, and he's getting a lot of content. Other people are doing the same. What the heck happened on that Sunday morning where none of you guys were there and all we have are a handful of stills? How come we never got that solid video, film photography of the main eruption? What happened?
Well, a couple things. They had declared it a red zone around the volcano, trying to keep people out of the area for safety reasons, but they didn't know what was going to happen. And there were a lot of mistakes made, I believe, on the part of the scientists and the government around this. Now, they hadn't experienced anything like this before. The only thing that they had experience from was Hawaiian volcanoes, which are totally different volcanic structure, totally different activity around a Hawaiian volcano. But that was the specialists they called in were mostly experienced in Hawaiian volcanoes. They had some experience internationally with other volcanoes. In fact, that was part of the problem, is that some of the scientists that were deployed to Mount St. Helens had just come from another volcano that had built up energy and then it died down. But while it was building energy, they warned the people, they warned the population, and then nothing happened. And then they were kind of called false prophets. So they came to Mount St. Helens with the idea that they were only going to talk about what was happening rather than what could happen. And that was part of the problem, is that they didn't tell people kind of the worst case scenario, which to a lot of observers, the north side bulging like it was building up a lot of pressure, and it was building up in a very magnificent way. And it had to be released at some point. And that's what a lot of the questions were around it. But it was just more of a, let's wait and see and only talk about what was happening, not about what could happen there. And so what was your question again? Where did you want to go with that?
Well, specifically, it's just so interesting how you and others were capturing so much content
Mm-hmm.
before the morning of May 18th. But when the actual massive eruption happened, we don't have a lot of photography. We don't have a lot of film that captured that actual eruption.
Yeah, and again, that's due to them blocking off the area, and only people that had permission to be in there were there. Photographers, scientists, and then like even Harry Truman, the proprietor of the Mount St. Helens Lodge, Spirit Lake Lodge, he was deputized to help keep people out so he could stay. So, but they literally thought that they could give people enough warning to get out of there before something happened. They didn't predict the horizontal and vertical eruption that happened on May 18th. And there were no iPhones in those days, of course. So there were not any photographers set up ready to go. And it happened at 8:32 a.m. David Johnston, the scientist closest to the volcano, was setting up instruments, not film cameras, to document it. He was more interested in seismic signatures and tilt and the motion of the land and stuff like that. And, but he was very nervous about it, and he was very nervous about where he was. And he wasn't even supposed to be there that morning. He was filling in for somebody else. And that's another whole story. But yeah, we don't have, Gary Rosenquist shot a series of stills that were made into a movie of the actual eruption. And it's very good. It's very spectacular how with graphics, they were able to fill in the gaps between the still frames. And you can see that even in my film.
Was that scientist, is that the same scientist that said, Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it?
Yes.
Is that the same guy? Same guy?
Yes. Unfortunately, it was. Yeah. David Johnston was that scientist that lost his life up there. And that's why it's called Johnston Ridge to this day. And that's where the Johnston Ridge Observatory is and the visitor center.
So, Michael, there are moments in history that we do not forget. Was I alive on May 18th, 1980? I sure was, but I was a really little guy. So I don't remember it at all. I remember my parents telling me a bit about where they were at when the mountain erupted. Talk us through the morning of May 18th, 1980. Where were you? What were you doing? Were you caught off guard? What was going on?
Yeah, on May 18th, 1980, I was having breakfast with my friend Joel. And for some reason, we turned on the radio and we heard immediately that Mount St. Helens had just erupted. And we're like, oh no, we're not there. So we grabbed our camera, grabbed our gear, and drove up there immediately. Now, it took us a few hours to get there. By the time we got there, they had closed a lot of the roads, they had closed things off, and we saw just mud-choked rivers filled with logs come barreling down from the volcano. But we couldn't see it from our vantage point from Interstate 5. But I found a phone booth and I called this production company in Seattle and asked them if they were covering this and if they needed any help. And they said, yes, go straight to Boeing Field. We will have a helicopter waiting for you to have you follow that ash cloud that came out of Mount St. Helens and that is headed east. The producer of that production company was going to go straight to Mount St. Helens and film what he could from a helicopter vantage point. So that was where it really kicked in for me to get involved in it, was filming not just the devastation around the volcano, but then to chase that ash cloud into eastern Washington from a helicopter.
So, folks that don't know the geography of this area, Michael's in Oregon. He's heading up I-5. We've got Mount St. Helens to the east of him as he's traveling up I-5, and he's going actually past Mount St. Helens. So it's a part of the Cascades. He's going past Mount Rainier. That's the big famous one we've got. And then he's getting himself to Boeing Field so he can get on that helicopter. How did you feel, Michael, about not just stopping at Mount St. Helens, but knowing I actually drive past this mountain to get closer to it?
Yeah, we had connected with this film company in Seattle earlier. They had been known for climbing Mount St. Helens when it was erupting in some of the early eruptions and filming looking straight down into the throat of the volcano and making headline news for doing that. So we had connected with them just to share our interest in this. And my friend Joel was a musician. He wrote a song about Mount St. Helens. So we, so, so we, that's how come we called him. This was Otto Sieber, and his company was Hard Hat Cine Photo. And he had done mostly industrial films, but he was determined, like I was, to make a film about Mount St. Helens. So, but he had a budget and he had nice camera equipment. And so, but this was an opportunity for me to really get involved in it. And I love flying in helicopters, and I had done that many times in television news. So I went and jumped in that helicopter. I guess we didn't know enough to know how dangerous that was. They didn't know that volcanic ash was hazardous to aviation. Now we had a hunch that it wasn't safe, but all I can remember is flying from Western Washington into Eastern Washington, trying to catch up with that ash cloud, and going from evergreen forest into a gray, just monochrome, ash covered trees and into that black ash cloud. And that's when the pilot actually got very nervous. It was very thick ash where we were at, and he landed the helicopter in a restaurant parking lot in Vantage, Washington. And just as he did, I got out of the helicopter and started filming that ash cloud going over us, and where we could see day turning into night. And the thick ash coming down, and people in Vantage wondered what's going on. It felt like snowfall, but it wasn't going away. It felt like snowfall because it was silent. And by that time, everybody knew that Mount St. Helens had erupted and it was ash coming out of the volcano. So the pilot got very nervous, said, we need to get back to Seattle. So we got in the helicopter, started flying back. And that's when the engine quit. That's not a good thing when you're in a helicopter. But he said, relax. I had to do this all the time in Vietnam. And he had to put it into auto rotate or whatever they call that. And he was able to navigate the helicopter, and we landed in the middle of Interstate 90. Now, by that time, the State Patrol had already closed Interstate 90 because of the heavy ash that was coming down. And so we got a visit from the sheriff's department, and they were not happy with us for landing the helicopter in the middle of the highway. But we told them what had happened and asked if we could get a ride to town, and he gave me a ride to town. And for some reason, the Ford dealer there gave me a rental vehicle, and I drove back to Seattle. I was like the only person on Interstate 90 driving, but it was thick black ash coming down. I could barely see, and I was white knuckling it all the way back. I felt like the last man on earth. But I had to get that film footage back to Seattle because the producer, Otto Sieber, was invited to be on the Johnny Carson show that night to show his footage that he had shot. He had shot aerial footage of devastation around the volcano, and then he wanted my footage also. And so I did get back, and the film was processed, and he headed to LA and shared that footage, the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And then after the show, he came back and said, I really liked your footage. They liked it. And I'd like you to go into the volcano with me. And I'm like, what do you mean by that?
So how much later was it when you were chasing that ash cloud from the first and most significant major eruption on the morning of May 18th? When was that exactly?
That's Well, that was the next day that he actually went down to be on the Johnny Carson show. Yeah,
Great. So
probably
you
May
actually
19th or
you
May
actually were
20th.
you were chasing the ash cloud same day. So it had erupted earlier that day when you started to chase it?
Yep, yep.
Got it. Because, I was thinking about this, Michael. I know that ash cloud, it didn't it circumnavigate the entire planet? Eventually got so high up into the atmosphere that it just carried it on the jet streams across the whole planet. So you were there right at the beginning. And if folks remember, just as Michael's sharing, it was going east. And so there was all these communities that were in eastern and central Washington that were getting hit heavily by the ash cloud. And the major areas like Tacoma and Everett and Seattle and Bellevue, they were spared largely compared to those other areas. And folks were struggling to have their cars even work because those carburetors back in the day were pulling in so much ash and cars were stalling out. So you were there chasing that cloud right after it had formed and right after it erupted.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was still very thick. And this was hours, quite a few hours later after the eruption. And but it did turn day into night and made it very difficult for people in Eastern Washington. And for us, flying in that was quite nerve-wracking for me. This pilot was a ex-Vietnam War pilot, so he was, he had a contingency plan, I guess.
Whatever happened to
Um,
that guy? What happened to the
I don't know.
helicopter? What
I
happened
don't
to the
know. The
helicopter? Did
helicopter
they
was trashed. I mean, the engines had to be replaced on it, but
So they probably had to have someone come and just haul that helicopter
yeah.
off the freeway.
Mhm. Yep, before they could open it up again, yep.
And when you landed,
I don't know because everything was happening so fast after that too. I don't
Mhm.
even know what happened. I never followed up with that.
Well,
And
when you landed, basically what you were saying, and I'm gonna mess this up, but they basically, I think what happens is they start rotating really fast the other way, and then you get like a hard drop, right? So what did it feel like when that helicopter made contact with the ground? What did that feel like?
well, I was scared and he said as soon as the helicopter lands, jump out, it might catch on fire.
Oh my.
And so I did. I was out of the helicopter before he even finished talking about that because I was like ready to be on the ground. And my feet were like jello. I could hardly walk. I was so scared. But it was not, it was, he landed it safely and it was a good thump when we landed, but I was so thankful to be on the ground. And then it seemed like only moments later that the sheriff showed up and then gave me a ride to town.
And it's actually testament to his ability to be able to actually land on I-90,
Yeah.
meaning that
He was
he
able
wants
to
something.
navigate it. Right.
Yeah, he wants something that's flat because it's gonna be hard enough to land it like that. Landing it in a field or, God forbid, a forest would have been too difficult. So even though it was frustrating for, Washington State Department of Transportation, it was a good thing you guys hit I-90.
Yes. And then I went on to Ritzville and filmed, cars and street lights on and all of that stuff right after that, and then drove the footage back to Seattle.
And folks, if you want to go online and just do some searches for like Central and Eastern Washington eruption, Mount St. Helens eruption, you'll see some great shots where it looks just like Michael shared. It's like it looks like it's the middle of the night, and it looks maybe like you're in like a sandstorm in the Sierra or something like that. It's pretty incredible.
Yep.
Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit here. You are on mission. I love it. You go to the Ford dealership, you get yourself, what'd they give you? Like a Mustang, something like that? What'd
I
you
don't
get?
remember
Yeah.
some car.
Okay, he gets his Escort. Let's just say he got his Escort. He drives up to Seattle off of I-90, gets that footage over so it can be on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. I love it. What brought you back to the mountain? What did that journey look like? How did you get back to the mountain, Michael?
So yeah, I was 20 years old and, this was just the beginning of the adventure for me, really. And when Otto said he liked my footage and he wanted me to go into the volcano with him, I said, okay, let me find out if that's okay. And so I called my dear mother and asked her what she thought. And she said, as your mother, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard you say you want to do, but I'll be praying for you. And that's all I needed to hear was that I'll be praying for you. And I said, thanks, Mom. And I was then off to my next adventure and to go in and we knew that we would be the first camera crew to go in to film the devastation from the ground. We had been in helicopters, and all the news agencies had been in helicopters flying around looking at the devastation. And so we took a few days to make plans and get everything ready, and to fly back into the area and film the devastation from the ground. The plan was just to go in for a few hours to document what it was like up close. And our plan was to try to get into where Spirit Lake Lodge was, to see what had happened to Harry Truman in that Spirit Lake Lodge. But we had no idea what we were going into. But our plan was to go in on one point and then try to get to another point and meet the helicopter and fly out of there. Well, everything changed once we went in there. But the days leading up to that, I remember kind of being excited in a very cautious way about going into there, knowing that this major eruption just happened, that it probably already did its business and we'll probably be okay. But nobody knew for sure. Do volcanoes erupt again after they erupt in a big eruption, or did it spend all of its energy? It seemed like the reports were that it had spent all of its energy because it wasn't there anymore. The whole mountain was gone. And those were the reports and some of the early footage coming back, so that's what it was like trying to get ready to go in there.
So you're back at the mountain. Did you get to what was Spirit Lake? Were you able to get to Harry Truman's spot?
So the plan was, there was 5 of us on this camera crew. So there was the producer director, I was the cinematographer, there was a sound man, grip, and a still photographer that focused on stills. And he was an award-winning still photographer. And we didn't want to interrupt or get in the way of any search and rescue that was going on. So we entered the area from the fringe of the blast zone, not knowing what it was like on the ground. So our helicopter flew us in very low to the ground, up into the area, and dropped us off on the fringe. And then,
when you say the fringe, you mean that this area didn't have the trees falling over like toothpicks like everywhere else?
The trees they were all fallen over, but not that far away from there. There were still trees standing. So we knew the closer we got, the more the devastation would be. And so we just started following the fall of the trees towards the volcano. So the helicopter dropped us off, but he didn't want to land in it because he didn't know what was underneath it. So we had to jump out of the helicopter, and that in itself was quite scary to jump into.
How far did you have to jump? How far? I
mean,
was
he got drop? As low as possible, but it was still a good 6 to 10 feet that we had to jump off into this ash and tree debris. And that was scary. But I was able to jump out and make it okay, and grab a backpack filled with cameras and film.
Did you have any trepidation getting back on that helicopter after crash landing a couple days before?
Well, it was a different helicopter. The other one that crash landed was still sure.
But I mean, just getting back on a helicopter, right? And saying like, I'm going to do this again, even though I have a pretty bad track record, meaning the last flight I was on, I crash landed, right? I mean, did that go through your mind at all? Like, I might have to do that again?
I don't know. I was 20 years old. I don't think it was computing to me. Everything was happening so fast. And I think, once again, being that television news cameraman, that I was used to covering other people's tragedies, other people's disasters. And this was just another disaster that was happening. And we knew there were a lot of missing people at that time, and they were pulling out, the remains of people too. We knew that, but that was all from May 18th. And so, we had an assignment to go in and film the devastation from the ground and show the rest of the world what that was like up close. Because, like I said, the only footage that we had seen before was from the air, from helicopters. So that was our mission.
great. So you got a group of 5 of you, including yourself. You're the cinematographer. You jump out of the helicopter. Helicopter does not land with you. So what's the job at that point, Michael? Are they saying, "Oh, we want you just to hike around and get a first person's perspective of the blast zone? And like you said, we're going to pick you up in this other area." So are you basically on a cinematography hike through the blast zone?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We were on this hike filming the devastation that we saw. And the closer we got to Mount St. Helens, the more the devastation and the heavier the ashfall had been. Now, this was a nice day that we went in there. It was a nice day. You could see clearly. And the struggle was climbing up and over all of the debris. And it took us so much longer than we expected. And we did not know what to expect till we got in there. And so we realized that we were going to probably spend the night, and that was a possibility, that we were going to have to spend the night, and then we would rendezvous with a helicopter that next morning. And I'll never forget that night. And we that was the plan. And I think we had communicated with helicopter that we were going to stay the night and then meet them at such and such point the next morning. And but the problem was that night, the thing that I remember the most was just how deathly silent it was. It was so quiet. We could not hear anything because the ash layer, all the trees were down. There was no wind blowing in the forest like you normally hear. There was no creaking of trees. There was no wildlife. Everything was gone.
It was like you were on
Was
the moon.
It was like, yeah, it was like we were on the moon, but it was like we were in a soundstage because the ash just absorbed all the sound. Even talking among ourselves felt really weird because all the sound was absorbed. And the whole landscape was totally different. And I had been in these same areas just prior to the eruption when I would go in to film some of the early ash eruptions that happened in March and April. And now we are here, we are in mid-late May, and everything was upside down. It seemed like the volcano changed the landscape. It changed everything. And that night there was a full moon, and the moon shined through the whatever clouds there were and shined and bounced off the ash. And it just felt like a very eerie horror film set is what it felt like walking around in that. And very, very quiet.
So there were trees down, there was ash and a big mess down there. Did you come across a lot of wildlife that had perished as well? Did you see that too?
Most everything had been buried in the ash. We did find some deer that we were able to tell outline of a deer. And when we dug down into it, we saw the dead carcass. But that was all that we saw of any kind of wildlife.
It
And
was just really covered. How about like pumice and whatnot? Was that down there as well too, or was it mainly ash that you
I
saw?
think the pumice, we were too close, and it was mainly heavy ash that had fallen close to the volcano where we were. And the pumice got carried further away. There was
Got
there
it.
were pumice plains later that I discovered, but not during the time that we were up there. Missed.
Okay, so Michael, you basically get dropped off. I mean, I love how nonchalant you are. I mean, that is how we were in our 20s. Like, I jumped 6 to 10 feet into unknown abyss. I mean, we did that stuff back then. I'd hate to try to do something like that now.
Exactly.
Um, And you all 5 of you guys get out, and then you go on your hike to capture stuff as much as possible. Did you guys know that you were gonna be spending the night there? Did you have enough gear so you could have a at least a quasi-comfortable night in in
Not
in the forest?
not planning on spending the night really. And if we did, we were gonna just keep moving and then film what we could in the morning and then get out of there. That was the plan. We wanted to get out of there as quick as possible.
So
But
your
as
goal
soon
was your goal was to actually not spend the night there? It was to basically do couple-hour hike and then get on that next helicopter out?
That's right. But because it was so incredibly difficult to move around in it, we realized that we could not get what we needed, which was closer to the volcano. And something else we discovered in the first hours was that our compass did not work. The compass started spinning in circles because the heavy magnetism and the ash caused the compass to lose true north. And so
What did that do to you guys in regards to navigating around?
that was difficult. It was challenging, and it caused a lot of arguments between some of these former military guys who were used to their compasses and their maps and things like that, which were now useless.
Did you get to have a say in that, or were you like, hey, I'm the cinematographer, I'm not a navigator, even if the compass and the map was in the best of scenarios? Did you just leave it to them to argue that out, or were you in the fray?
That's right. No, I was quiet. I was 20 years old. They were a lot older than I was, most of them, and they were experienced. Some of them, like I said, had been in the military. So it got heated between them later when we were in stressful situations with this. But this was still early on, and we just felt like, okay, we'll just keep moving. In the morning, we'll figure it out. But the problem was the first daybreak, we saw rescue helicopters following our footsteps. They had gotten into our path thinking we were survivors. So the producer did not want us to have to jettison the assignment we had, which was to try to get to Spirit Lake and figure out what happened to Harry Truman and that whole area closer to the volcano. So he encouraged us to run and hide from the helicopters, but we're like, that's ridiculous. We can't do that. Plus out here, we're pretty much in the open. So they came up on us and saw us, and then they landed. And these were National Guard search and rescue. And they landed and came and asked us what we were doing there. And we told them that we were journalists. We were up there documenting. And we told them our situation, that we had a map and we had a compass that didn't work. And they said, well, welcome to the club. We have the same problem. Our navigation equipment is being messed up by the magnetism also. But they did have a better compass and they had some newer maps, and they actually gave it to us. They gave us the compass and the maps, and they offered us a ride out, but we refused, saying, no, that's okay. We want to finish our assignment and we will meet our helicopter later today. And so they took off, and then they reported us to the sheriff's department that we were, that they had spotted us in there, which was their job to tell about what they were doing and what they had seen and witnessed with us. So anyways, they took off and we continued on our journey, continued filming this. And then later that afternoon, we realized that our batteries had been left on and we had no communication with our helicopter, and we were lost, and we could not make sense of the maps anymore because of really the change in topography. The landscape had seemed to change, and by this time we're pretty delirious too. We had been hiking that day all night
Michael,
long.
you had a map that was phenomenal if you were there about a week earlier, but because you were there when you were, that map was kind of useless.
That's right. That map was useless, and our compass was useless, and all of our plan A, plan B, and was gone. And we had no communication with our helicopter.
Your goal is to get to point B, to get picked up in a couple hours. You're now on day 2 of hiking through this area?
That's right. Yeah. This is day 2. And by this time, I was ready to get out of there. We could feel earthquakes. We could hear things popping and rumbling in the distance, and we had no idea what was happening. And we knew the volcano was right there, and we were within a short shot of it, and that at any minute it could erupt again and, wipe us out. So I had felt like I was in there long enough. I had enough footage of down trees and terrain. Even if we don't see Mount St. Helens, I felt like I was ready to leave. I was ready to get out of there. So that afternoon, and with no communication with our helicopter, we see a helicopter in the distance coming towards us. And it's sheriff's deputy comes and lands on a logging road near us. And there's 2 Huey helicopters hovering in the background. Now, this deputy sheriff came up to us and said that he was going to give us citations for being in the area, and that we told him our situation and what had happened, and our plan was to communicate with our helicopter to come and get us. And he actually refused to do that. He refused to communicate for us to our helicopter. He
Why?
refused to give us a ride out, even though
Why? What's going on?
there were military helicopters waiting to take us out. And, I don't know if it's just human nature or what, but, I'm not going to name this individual, but he refused to give us a ride. I guess he wanted to teach us a lesson, and he wanted to teach others a lesson that you don't come in this area. And so he left us without anything. He left us late afternoon with no backup. And he waved off the other helicopters too and told them no go. And so we were left. And that's when I started getting really nervous that here we are facing another night on this Mount St. Helens area. And we were facing Mount St. Helens at this time. We were close to Spirit Lake. And I felt very nervous about that. And everybody was exhausted by this point, and we wanted to just lay down and rest. But I felt very nervous about that. And I asked if we could at least go up over this ridge, up higher to a higher elevation. And so we actually hiked up to the top of what was Mount Margaret. And we got to the top of that, and there was this giant cedar tree that had fallen over in the eruption. Everything was flat around this because it was so close to the volcano. And we were able to scoop aside the cold ash and lay down in that and lay down in the warm ash to try to get warm. And we just knew that we had to wait it out another night. And then in the morning, maybe somebody would come and get us, because by now they know that we're gone, that we're lost, and that we had no communication and no reliable navigation at all.
Michael, did you fight with this guy? I mean, at least verbally, that wouldn't take you guys out of there? I mean, that sounds incredible. He, to some degree, if anything bad did happen, if you guys died, he'd be liable for that, right? Did you guys do everything you could to try to get on that helicopter?
There's a story behind all of that, but he was acting irrational, and I started filming him and filming this conversation he was having with the producer. And basically he just was, I don't know, just wanted to prove a point. I don't know what the problem was. I've talked to him a couple of times since then, but it's a part of the story I don't usually go into, because, after this is where my life changed. It was after this point, and it was all becoming very humbling, because here I am 20 years old, and we're faced another night at Mount St. Helens. And this is not summertime, and this is not a summer hike. This is, in the middle of a major volcanic eruption, and we're exposed to the elements. And when we're higher elevation, it was freezing cold at night, and we were not prepared for any of this. We had planned for being in there a few hours and maybe a night if we had to, but we were not planning on even camping that night. It was just—
What about food? What about food and water? Did you guys have plenty of rations?
We were very ill prepared for that. We had no MREs, no food. We had one baggie full of gorp, which was a peanut and carob mix. That was all we had. And that was gone in the first few hours, because we thought, hey, we're going to get out of here anyways. And then we only had one canteen among 5 of us of water. Now, fortunately, there was fresh artesian water gurgling up out of the ground that we were able to refill that canteen with. And it was glacier melt that had been blasted off the volcano, buried in hot ash, and then it forced the water to come up out of the ground. It was very weird, very unusual, but it was really good tasting, fresh mountain water. And
That
that's
is
what we
so
survived on
incredibly, that is
time.
unique. That is unique, incredibly expensive water. And a lot of processes made that water happen.
That's right.
Okay, so
good relief.
So Michael, you're not being dropped off. You're not being picked up. You're having to face another night. What's going on? Bring us back to that point.
So that night,
Keep moving us.
I was very, very nervous about being there, very nervous about the volcano being right there next to us. And we had one space blanket, one sleeping bag with us that we brought along for emergency, thinking if we found a survivor that they would need to have some kind of help. But we were a very ill-prepared camera crew. We basically went in there to get our shots and get out of there. But here we are trapped now on the top of Mount Margaret under this giant cedar root. And that night at 2:39 a.m., Mount St. Helens erupts in the second largest eruption. Now, here we are right next to it. We don't hear a thing. It's totally silent. The sound wave from that eruption went straight up, hit the stratosphere 80,000 feet high, bounced off that, and people 300 miles, 300 miles away heard what was like a sonic boom of that eruption at 2:39 a.m. But you had to be 300 miles away to hear it because there's an immediate zone around the volcano where it's totally silent. But we knew something was happening because the sky started lighting up like a giant fire and like giant flames of fire. All the static electricity and the ash cloud flashing through layers of ash created these brilliant colors, kind of like orange and green and blue and purple and yellow flashes of lightning. And this isn't normal lightning. This is sheet lightning happening right over our heads for 7.5 hours. Now, we knew something very strange was happening. We knew the volcano was probably erupting and that at any second, another blast wave could come and hit us and wipe us out. Now, that's a very sobering thought to think that you're here 1 second and gone a second, because that's what happened to a lot of people. They had no warning. The volcano erupted, and within seconds, they were gone. They were pulverized by that pyroclastic surge that came out of the volcano. And so it's during those night hours that we're laying there, observing the sky, wondering what is happening. I think I tried filming it, but it's just a blur in the lens because it's at the middle of the night and there's this light flashing in the sky. And it's a very humbling experience because you're thinking at any second you could be wiped out. And that's when I started thinking, well, if I die here, am I going to go to heaven or hell? And I grew up going to church, but I'd never thought about that. I never thought about my life spiritually until that moment, because going to church, you kind of learn all about God. You learn that there's a heaven and you learn that there's a hell, and that when you die, you want to go to heaven. But I started asking myself that question. Here I am, 20 years old. If I die, am I going to go to heaven or hell? And the thing that scared me the most was not, is the volcano going to get me? But I couldn't answer that question with any kind of certainty. I couldn't answer the question that if I die in that moment, am I going to go to heaven? So I started doing some deep soul searching at that moment. And I started just saying, help? God, if you're real, help. That was about all I knew how to pray, was help. And then I started, I think, crying out to God, saying, God, I believe in you, but show me that you're real, and show me that you are here with me, or that you can help us. And that became my prayer. But that night, the volcano continued to erupt. And then as the sun started coming up that morning.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
How about everyone else, Michael? How is everyone else responding to it? This is an incredible situation that you guys were going through, an amazing experience. How was everyone else around you?
Well, some of them had been in war and in Vietnam or whatever, and you just don't know what's going to happen there either. So it's kind of like a foxhole situation. So everybody's just kind of writing it out to see what's going to happen. I think because there's that attitude that, well, we're men, we got ourselves into this, we're going to get ourselves out of this. But so far, none of those plans, plan A, plan B, plan C, were not working. And even though we were close to being lifted out of there, that did not happen. We were trapped for whatever reason. we were trapped and left there, and now we were experiencing this. And it became almost like, is this a bad dream that's going to, someday we're going to wake up and it'll all be over? Or what's going to happen? We just didn't know. So I think we all processed it differently, and we were all very quiet. We hardly talked among ourselves. We hardly even talked about what was happening or what was going to happen, or, are we going to make it out of here? Are we going to make it out of here alive? We couldn't even process that. I think
Could you
we
tell
just thought day to day, moment by moment, second to second.
Could you tell us a little bit about that second eruption? Because I know if that happened, did you say it was at 2:39, meaning that what was up, what was down, what was left, what was right? It was really confusing. But I'm sure that we have our scientists now, in 40 some odd years later, are able to say exactly what happened. How big was this eruption compared to the initial massive eruption that St. Helens is famous for? And what type of eruption was this? And how did that impact the area? What happened?
So the first eruption did a very unusual eruption, which it did this horizontal blast where the whole, at 8:32 a.m., there was a 5.1 earthquake that shook the whole north face, which had been crumbling. It had been bulging out and crumbling for, the last previous 8 weeks. So that earthquake shook that loose and then exposed all of this pressure that had been building for 150 years. It exposed that pressure and instantly created this massive eruption where the energy went out both horizontal and vertical. The horizontal blast was like a hurricane wind, 300 miles an hour, 1,500, 2,000 degree Fahrenheit blast of wind that went across the landscape, knocking and destroying everything in its path, killing 57 people. And then the blast went up 80,000 feet into the stratosphere. And so it expended all of its horizontal energy, but it still had energy left in a week later. So it was exactly a week later. May 18th was the Sunday morning. And then a week later, Sunday morning, May 25th, was the second largest eruption, where it was a vertical eruption only. Now, these are stratovolcanoes. So that means it sends the eruption cloud up tens of thousands of feet all the way to the stratosphere. And then it gets up into the jet stream, and then it gets carried across the country and eventually around the world. 1 week later, ash was falling in Boston, Massachusetts, and a year later, ash was falling on the other side of Mount St. Helens. So it went all the way around the world. And on the second eruption, scientists say it was the second largest eruption, second largest now in U.S. history. And we were right there underneath it. But by the grace of God, it was a vertical eruption only. There was no mass for it to come out horizontally. And we would have been right in dead center of that horizontal eruption had it done that again, because we were on the north side that had been so badly devastated. And that was our plan, was to film the area that had been badly devastated, film it from the ground. So here we are now, the morning of May 25th, waking up to this. And what happened at that night is it had actually created its own volcanic weather. And so the volcanic ash mixed in with the weather that was moving in, and it created this very, very thick fog. And what they call it fog in Hawaii, and I would call it fog at Mount St. Helens too, because it was a mixture of this ash fallout and weather. And we could barely see 5-10 feet in front of us. It was so thick. And we even filmed like our boots on the ground and how thick the fog was. And we had no idea which direction to go. The compass was rendered useless. We knew that Mount St. Helens was to the north of us and that we needed to keep going away from it. And we just followed the falling of the trees, but we stumbled mostly that day. We barely went quarter of a mile, maybe a half a mile at the most. And it was freezing cold. That was the thing, is that the volcano lowered the temperature even down to freezing temperatures. And And this is where it got really bad for us. And I started experiencing hypothermia. Now, this is the third day in now, and we are totally exhausted. We had exhausted what little peanut and carob mix that we had, the gort mix that we had. We were able to continue drinking water, but that was all that we had among the five of us. And we were just shivering. I was just shivering cold and wet. And we got really wet because it started heavy snowfall too. And the snowfall coming on us, and we knew that we needed to try to find shelter, but it was very, very difficult to try to find shelter. And
what would you say, Michael, like at this point, you had lived through the second largest eruption in U.S. history. Your visibility is next to gone. Are you asking yourself, and is your team asking yourself, can helicopters even get anywhere close to where we're at? Because, you experienced it earlier when that ash choked out that helicopter and dropped you guys. Are you thinking like, we just got to wait this out? Or we got to find a clearing where the ash isn't as thick? What was your plan? What did you guys plan on? What were you planning on doing?
well, I think we made the plans as we went because none of our plans had worked. And the next plan was knowing that search and rescue could not fly at those elevations in that weather. And it was very dangerous for them that we had to get out of there ourselves. And that's what we tried to do. But it was at least 22 miles out to the nearest road or anything from there. Plus, we were in very difficult terrain. It was very mountainous, and the trees were so thick that it had fallen down that it made travel almost impossible through this. And there's a lot of photos, and you can see all of this in our film. And we filmed this quite a bit, our struggle in trying to get out of that, because we felt like maybe this is the last film that anybody will see of us. Even so, we filmed not only the terrain around us, but showed it from a human perspective, what it was like for humans to try to climb up and over and through this downed forest, this devastated forest. And we knew that we needed to try to get dry and try to get shelter. And that was very difficult to do because there was no shelter and there was no dry branches or anything because they had all been blasted off from the trees, from the blast of the eruption. The branches had been broken off and gone, stripped of trees. So trying to find anything that's even breakable to make into firewood was very difficult. Plus, it expended energy and was hard to even to do that. So it was this next day, this struggle, that I really started even praying harder. It was really more of a prayer for help. God, if you're real, help me and show yourself to me. And, just really thinking about life and death. And at 20 years old, you don't think you're going to die. You don't think that at all. But in this
You don't think
situation,
you don't think you're going to die ever at 20.
exactly. And we had been through so much. And then, like I said, I've always had the protection of my camera, hiding behind my camera. Now the camera was not helping me because I was freezing cold and shivering. And all I could think of was getting out of there and having a nice hot meal and a good night's sleep. That's all I could think of. But struggling through this, we continued to deteriorate and continued to lose energy. And the more we struggled, the worse it became. And we had the thought that maybe what we needed to do was try to crawl underneath some trees and get out of the weather. And then maybe two of us would go off to try to find search and rescue. But we also knew that wasn't a very good idea. So we decided that it'd be better to stay together. And so that's what we did. But there was one point later in this day where we had been struggling a lot that I just felt totally drained. We had been fighting through all of this now for I don't know how many countless hours, and no sleep at all and no food, shivering, shaking. All I wanted to do was lay down and go to sleep. And I leaned up against this large tree that had fallen over. And I just had this vision, this dream, this experience where I was literally floating out of my body. I could see myself leaning against this tree. And I was just flying up like away, like from a helicopter point of view, away from what I was looking at. And I looked across the ash field and I saw all the broken trees. And I saw this person come walking towards me. And he was dragging one of these broken trees. And he looked very badly injured, bloodied and scarred. And the closer he got, the more I saw how badly injured he was. And as he got closer to me, I saw that it was Jesus on his way to Calvary. I had this out-of-body experience. I don't know what it was, this experience where I saw Jesus carrying this broken tree, and he stopped and he looked at me, and his eyes just pierced right into my eyes. And when he did, I just felt this burst of energy, this burst of, I don't know, just greatest love that you could ever imagine. And this burst of energy come into me. And I woke up from this experience and I felt like I had a full night's sleep and a full breakfast. And I just started hiking. And I hiked right up to this group of trees that had been blasted against the side of a hill, and it made a natural cave. And the other guys followed me, and we went into this little cave and were able to scrounge enough branches to make a fire and to try to get warm. And I felt like I'd been, relieved for a bit there. But at the same time, I remembered something that my dad had given me before I went in there. And this is very uncharacteristic of him. I'd totally forgotten about it, but I had in my parka a small pocket Bible. And I thought, oh, I remember I have this. So I needed like a word of encouragement. And I pulled that pocket Bible out and I just kind of blindly opened it up, hoping for a word of encouragement, like you will be rescued in your day of disaster or something like that. But instead, I opened up to, for your sake, we are considered as sheep to be slaughtered all the day long. Now, that was not very encouraging. But I read on, it said, and neither height nor depth nor all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And after having that encounter with Jesus and after reading that scripture, I had a total peace that no matter what happened to me, no matter what happened there, that if I lived or I died, that I was going to be in the Lord's hands, that I was going to be okay. And that
did you get a chance to share this experience with the other folks that you were with, or was that just for you?
that was just for me at that moment. And we were processing things so differently and individually that we didn't talk about what was happening at the time. But it was later, I was able to share that with all of the guys, yes, about that experience that I had. And that it was a spiritual experience for me. And, how that changed my life. It changed the whole focus of my life. Just weeks before that, I was planning to go to film school and go to California. But, that little weather newspaper article changed my whole direction of my life.
It's amazing how what at the time can seem like very insignificant parts of our story can be incredibly significant like that, Michael.
Yeah, it totally changed the whole trajectory of my life that did. And we're still trapped there. We're still in this little shelter that we had.
But you got a fire. You guys are warming up. You've got courage flowing through you at that moment. You had your second wind. Where do you guys go from there?
So we had a short reprieve. That night, there was an avalanche that came down and almost buried us because of all the loose ash.
Could you hear that avalanche coming?
No, it just started coming down as a trickle of mud, and then it got bigger and bigger, and then it just started flooding our whole space, and we had to scurry out of it because it was filling up our space really fast. All of the moisture coming down, the rain and the snow that was coming down loosened up that ash and made this mud flow come down. So we had to scurry out of that. Now we're wet and muddy coming out of that, and now we had to find another shelter. So we spent the next day trying to hike out of there, trying to get out of there. But again, the fog was so bad, and trying to navigate through that was very difficult. Plus the exhaustion that we were experiencing at that point too. But we had another whole day of trying to hike out of there, and
So,
another night. We had to spend another night there too.
how many miles do you think you had covered during this time? Because, from our perspective, just listening into your story, it seems like it's a slog. It seems like it's incredibly slow. You were expecting to be there for a couple hours, and now you're days into this adventure that you weren't expecting. How many miles total do you think that you were traversing on a daily basis?
I have no idea, but it was just, I think the word you use, the slog, is a good one, because that's what we were doing. We're slogging our way through, and we couldn't count miles because it was such difficult terrain to walk through. Even walking through the ash fields where there was compacted ash, there was so much ash because we were so close to the volcano, had come down that it gave a layer of ash over the top of the trees. And at one point, there was this large drift of ash, and they asked me to walk across that ash field first. They said, Michael, you go across that ash field, and if you make it across there, then we'll follow you. If not, we'll find another way around.
Why did they choose you?
I don't know, because I was youngest, maybe. maybe maybe I still had energy at that point. I don't know, but they made me walk across that first, and I did. And halfway through, I fell down through the ash all the way up to my hips, and I was trapped in it. I couldn't get my foot out because it was caught in underbrush or whatever that was under that hot ash. Remember, the ash was 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit when it came out of the volcano. So by the time that 5 days later, walking in that stuff, it was still warm, not anywhere near that temperature, but it was still very warm, and it was burning my feet. And it actually burned the soles off my boots. And I had to tie my boots back together again with some twine that we had. But anyways, I was totally stuck in that. And Joel had to climb in on all fours to come up and help dig me out of that. And then we had to crawl on all fours to get across that over just to another area that didn't have the big ash. It was kind of like an ash drift, kind of like a big snow drift that we experienced, as big snow drifts in Minnesota or up by Crater Lake.
So you're getting past this. Talk us through how you actually got back up off the mountain. What happened, Michael?
So the next day, we're trying to get back to what was the Green River. And we were trying to get back there because at one time there used to be a road going up there. It was covered in down trees and whatever. There was no traveling in that, but we knew we had to keep getting as far away from the volcano as possible if we were going to survive and get out of there or ever be found. So here we are trudging our way through, trying to get back to the Green River, but the fog was so bad still. And we were able to find another shelter. And this time we were able to make a fire and stay in that shelter until things cleared again, so we could continue to hike or wait for search and rescue. And there had been no search and rescue from the time the volcano erupted till last time we saw the sheriff, till the time it erupted. We didn't hear any helicopters at all. We heard voices calling out to us, hello, hello, but it turned out it was ravens flying by. And they sounded like they were saying, hello, hello. And we would yell back at them, we're over here, we're over here. We thought they were search and rescue on the ground, but it was just ravens flying around. And that was the only wildlife that we saw the whole time we were there. And then, so here we are in the shelter, and we made another fire. And I remember looking at the fire, and I saw like a mental flash of a helicopter, maybe the sound of the fire or something. Like I heard the whirring sound of a helicopter, I thought. And we had been so keen listening for helicopters that a lot of times it was a false alarm, like the crows. And this time I got up out of the shelter and ran out to the edge of this ravine, looked down, and for the first time the weather had cleared enough to where I could see all the way down this ravine, and I could see the river down below us. the Green River. And I yelled to the other guys, hey, you guys, I can see the river down there. And then sure enough, I saw one Huey helicopter and another Huey helicopter following behind it. And they flew up the river and back down, and they were 2,000 feet below us. And their only assignment was to fly up and fly back down. And when I saw them leave off to our left, back down, and the other guys went back in the shelter, they saw the helicopters too, and we jumped up and down trying to wave our hands and trying to get their attention. But they were 2,000 feet below us, and they were looking down. I guess that what had happened was that they figured that if we had made it, if we survived the eruption and we made it, that we would have been smart enough to try to get back to the Green River, which is what we were trying to do. And that their only assignment was to fly up and down the Green River because it was dangerous flying higher elevations because there was still weather up there. So they were on their way back to the rescue center. And when I saw them leave, I saw all chance of us getting out of there leaving with them. And that's when I fell down on my hands and knees. I remembered from Sunday school that if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, that you could speak to the mountain and it would move. Well, I didn't want the mountain to move. I did not want that to happen. But I applied that same prayer to the helicopters, and I just prayed a prayer of faith that I had this experience where I encountered Jesus. I read a promise in the Bible about that God would never leave me. And I just applied that prayer of faith that I prayed for those helicopters to come back in the name of Jesus. And I don't know how much time went on, but I heard this audible voice speak to me, and it scared me to hear this audible voice. It spoke to me. It said, Michael, look up to your left. That's all that it said. But there was nobody around me. And when I turned and looked, I saw all the trees laid over flat, except for one tree looked to me like the shape of a cross. And I just stayed fixed on that image of that broken tree. It was the shape of a cross. And right at that point, I saw a helicopter rise over the ridge. And he came up and he saw me standing there, and he hovered around. They dropped 2 flares down with smoke, and then they took off and they landed above us, but we didn't know what they were doing. And so the other guys got excited. We all started gathering our supplies, thinking, okay, we've finally been rescued. But we saw them take off and leave. And then these pararescue guys came down, hiking from the helicopters down to where we were. And they said, hey, you don't know how happy we are to find you. I said, oh, you want to make a bet? Because we were the first live people that they had found, and that they didn't expect to find us. It was 256 square miles of devastation. And they were only guessing that we could have been in this area. And so their only mission was to fly up and down that Green River Valley. And they said, we only have about a 20-minute weather window. And if we don't get out of here, we're all going to be trapped here. We won't be able to fly in this. Now, 2 of the guys had rubbed their eyes after the eruption, and they got a lot of ash in their eyes, and they went blind. And my mother always told me, if you ever get anything in your eye, never rub your eye. And I actually had eye drops with me, and I kept dropping eye drops in my eyes to keep the ash out. And it stung so bad, it really burned bad to get scratchy ash in your eyes. And it was in everything, our nose and eyes and ears. But I never scratched my eye. And their eyes went blind. And so they had to be led to the helicopter. And I was able to walk to the helicopter myself. And they said, drop the pilots, the pararescue guy said, leave everything. We have to go. We don't have much time. But I grabbed my camera and my film tote, and we went to the helicopter, and then they took off, and it was like angels lifting us off. It felt like angels had come and rescued us. And to the credit of the Air National Guard rescue.
It was miraculous in as much as you thought that the helicopters were all gone. You prayed that prayer, and boom, over the horizon, here comes a helicopter. Did you get to interview that helicopter pilot and find out where he came from and what made him decide to search for you guys, specifically where you were at, and drop those flares down?
Yeah. So later, I had heard other people's experience with this. So I heard from my mother that she got a phone call from search and rescue saying that her son was missing and presumed dead because of how close we had been last seen and how close we were to the volcano when the sheriff deputy left us there. And then, they said that they couldn't get in there because of the eruption had created this weather. And that, so she immediately started a prayer chain and started praying for us. And then for the search and rescue guys, 20 years after our rescue, NBC News arranged to have reunion where we were able to meet the pilot that rescued me. And he actually flew us back to the place where he rescued me. And I was able to thank him for the first time. And then I was able to ask him what that was like for him. And he said that that's when he told me his only mission was to fly up and down the Green River and then to go and fly back to the rescue center in Toledo. But on their way back, he had this strong hunch to go up this one ravine. And he radioed to the other pilot in the other helicopter. And that helicopter pilot said, no, that's not our assignment. And it's dangerous to fly up into the mountain. But he said, I have to do it anyway. So he did. And the other pilot followed him. And he couldn't believe his eyes when he came over the ridge and saw me standing there. So it was like a miracle for him. It was a total miracle for us, that he listened to that hunch that he had. It was a spiritual experience for him, and he later became a pastor. And, once he left the military, he became a pastor and changed his life too. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of other things. I didn't get to talk to him that much about it, but I'm so thankful that I got to hear his side of the story and how miraculous that was. But that was really, really confirming to me about the things that God had done there for me, because all of our human strength, all of our human trying to survive, trying to do things, all of our plans had failed. But God came through for us, in my weak, very, very low understanding about God at that time. I did not really know God except from what I learned in church and Sunday school growing up. But, for me, it became very personal. It became a personal, relationship. And then I wanted to learn everything I could about God, because I had fresh lenses for faith at that point that I didn't have before this. I was focused on going to Hollywood and making movies is all I wanted to do before this happened. And now none of that mattered to me after this experience.
Michael, do you think that if you wouldn't have gotten picked up by that helicopter, you guys could have held on for a couple more days? And where would you guys have headed at that point?
I don't think that we could have held on for a couple more days. We were pretty much, being trapped in there this was the fourth day now. And that we had been struggling with hypothermia and with, all of the elements that were there. And I'll never forget the look on the medic when they checked us out. And the medic told us that we were very lucky to have been taken out at that moment, because he said we were, all of our vitals and everything showed that we were suffering from hypothermia. And then, two guys blinded by the ash and they couldn't see. They had to be let out by hand. And, their eyes later healed, but they had to wear patches on their eyes for 2 weeks so that their eyes could heal from it all. But they took us to the Toledo Rescue Center, and then they took us to the hospital to be checked out. And then after that, everybody went back to Seattle except for me, because I was the one who filmed all of the footage. And at that time, all of the network television news organizations were based in Portland, Oregon. And they asked me if I would go and edit the film with them and tell them about our film. And everybody else wanted to go back home to their families in Seattle. So they flew back home, and I got in a helicopter and went down to Portland with one of the network television, and they wanted me to edit the footage that night. I hadn't slept for 4 days. I hadn't eaten anything for 4 days. I was in shock from, surviving all of this, but the news had to be made.
How many hours of footage do you think you had at that point?
It wasn't a lot. We had reels of film. It was 16 millimeter film at that time. So it had to be processed. So the film was processed, and then it was put into an editing machine. And then they had me sit in the edit room at the affiliate, and the producer worked out a deal with the TV network to have an exclusive. So they got exclusive first look at our footage. And we were the first camera crew to go in on the ground. And we were the big news of that day, of that week, because they had found, the bodies that they could find. They had rescued everybody. Now we were put on the missing presumed dead list, and here we showed up, having survived the second largest eruption, having footage now of what it was like. So it was pretty big news. And we were in all the headlines and on television news. So everybody wanted to see the footage. So here I was sitting in the edit room with that. And I asked if there was any food around that I could eat something. They gave me a menu. I think I had a burger. And then I told them about the footage, but it was so difficult to put in words our experience and to try to explain it to them. I was able to tell them what the footage was, but that was about it. And the footage was on TV that night. And then I was given a hotel room, and that next morning, I'll never forget, I woke up and I opened the door, and the hallway was lined with dozens of reporters and news cameras and everything. And because they were all based in Portland, Oregon, and I was the only one, the only survivor there that was right there at Portland. Everybody else was in Seattle. Now, Seattle stations and whatever interviewed them too, but they wanted to know my story. And I had a difficult time kind of backing up, rewinding, and telling the story from when we went into all of the events that happened to us, And it wasn't until one of the reporters sat me down and said, "I know you had a spiritual experience, and I want to hear about it." How she knew that, how she even had the thought to even ask me that was beyond me, but that unlocked my heart and unlocked my memory to begin sharing what had happened for the first time.
Going back to your mom, they
Yeah.
said to your mother, "We presume your son is dead." How did that impact your mom? Because your mom said, "Hey, Michael, I'm going to be praying for you." What was that experience like for her?
Yeah. Well, your son is missing now. You're told presumed dead, but she was a person of faith. And that's what kind of encouraged me in this journey too, that my mother had faith and that she had faith in prayer. And she had a prayer chain that she was part of, that whenever anybody needed prayer, they would all dial and call each person. This is before cell phones, is before you could do a Zoom call with multiple people on it. So they had what they called a prayer chain, and she called the whole prayer chain, and everybody was praying for us. But she said she had peace, that I was going to be okay. When she prayed, she felt like the Lord's told her that I was in His hands and that I was going to be okay. And it was still traumatizing for her. And she was 8 months pregnant. So she had my brother. Let's see, May, June, about a month and a half later, she had my brother, my fourth brother, my youngest brother. So he was born right around the same time as Mount St. Helens.
So, Michael, you took this footage and you cut it, and it was on national news. Did you become a bit of a celebrity in your hometown? Did everyone know in Klamath Falls that you'd gone through something like this?
Yeah, when they found out that I was one of those survivors and one that had been, had this footage and been on all these TV shows. Yeah, when I went back home to Klamath Falls, all the local media wanted to do stories. And they interviewed my father. In fact, my father had been out fishing that entire weekend. He didn't even know any of this. And they were waiting for him when he got home to interview him, and he didn't know anything. My mother knew all about it because she had been in touch with the military and all of that. And so that, yeah, that was something, a story that I was able to then share. And by that time, I could articulate it better too, because it took time for us to kind of come out of the shock of it and then be able to explain it, what had happened to us. And it was an interesting for us because we weren't just observers of this natural disaster, but we became part of it. So we were able to tell it from a human perspective. And that's what made it different. And that's what made my film different that I did 15 years later. Because I had seen all the documentaries, everything ever made on Mount St. Helens, but I felt like nobody had told the story yet. In that I had an assignment to tell the story, but to tell it from a human perspective. Because everybody told this great event that had happened and how it changed the landscape, how it changed our understanding of geology and volcanology and geologic hazards and how it killed 57 people and caught us all off guard, all of that. But nobody told what it was like to experience it from a human perspective. And that's why I went out with my camera to begin interviewing other people who had experiences with Mount St. Helens, because mine was only one perspective. Mine was after the May 18th experience, eruption, and it was, during, the experience that we had. So that's the perspective that I had in telling the fire below us. And that's why I titled it that. It was the fire below us that changed my life and changed the life of so many in the Pacific Northwest. And to this day has taught us so much about the land underneath us and what's happening, because it's not just volcanoes that we begin to understand, but the process that fueled those volcanoes that is a much greater concern for all of us living in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, the Cascadia subduction zone. And that's something that I got very involved in also after this experience, because all of this changed my life in such a dramatic way, not just spiritually, but also it changed, really what I went on to do. And it changed, my whole outlook on life and what I went on to do even after that point at 20 years old.
Tell us about that. Michael, how did this experience influence what you did in the aftermath into the 80s, into the 90s, and how has it influenced you today?
Yeah. So after that experience, it was all so overwhelming. And we were asked to be on a lot of television shows and radio shows and newspaper articles, and just kind of telling our experience with that and our unique perspective that we had to not only document it, but from a human perspective. And there was one show called The 700 Club. It was Pat Robertson and CBN 700 Club asked me to share my story. And I did. And I shared about that experience I had back when I was in television news. And Pat Robertson hired me to shoot feature stories about faith, about stories of faith. And so he hired me to be his West Coast producer. So I did that for the next 7 years. It was such a great faith builder for me to tell stories of other people who had similar experiences or different experiences of faith. And it was a real growing time for me from the time I was 20 years old until, it still is, still to this day, 45 years later, we're headed towards the 50th anniversary of Mount St. Helens. And I'm still trying to learn everything I can about faith, but also about what we learned at Mount St. Helens and geologically. So because all of that was so overwhelming, I wanted to learn everything I could about volcanoes. And I did a film about that experience called The Fire Below Us. And that took me several years to make, because I wanted to do it the right way, and I wanted to be really well done. But I did not want to tell my story about faith in it, because I was afraid if I did, it would only be seen on Christian television. And I wanted it to be broadly seen by people. And I kept running into roadblocks with it. Number one, I never got funding for it, because everybody felt like there'd already been a lot of movies made about Mount St. Helens. Why make another one? But I felt like nobody had ever told the story of Mount St. Helens like I wanted to tell it. And by this time I had married, and we had 2 children, and my wife was pregnant with her 3rd. And I was about ready to give up. We had been working on this film for about 8 years, trying to tell the story of Mount St. Helens and what happened to us and how it affected people. And I told my wife that it wasn't worth the risk. It wasn't worth all the time and expense that it was costing us. We didn't have any real furniture in our house or anything, because all of our money was going into me trying to make this independent film. And she said to me, "When you're an old man, are you going to regret not having done that? And I said, yes, I want to have this film for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren so that they will know the story. And she said, okay, then I'm going to put a deadline on it. You need to have it done by the birth of our next child, which at that point she was already pregnant and the next child was going to be born. And so I had a real deadline. And by that time, things actually started coming into place. And then another thing was that I was kind of convicted that I didn't want to add my story of faith into it. And so I had sent it to an agent that had already showed a rough cut of the film to some people at the Discovery Channel. And they said, we love this, we want this film, but it's missing something. It's missing your personal story. And I didn't want to tell my personal story, because then I'd have to tell the story of prayer and faith. And they said, you need to tell that story in it. This is the Discovery Channel. So I said, okay. And so I did. And then that's when the film finally finished. And it did tell the story of prayer and faith. And then this agent sent it to the Discovery Channel. They immediately made me an offer on it, but I didn't feel good about it. So I sent it to National Geographic Television, and they immediately offered me 5 times more for it, and they wanted the film. And I said I was sorry to the people at Discovery, but I felt like I was supposed to go to National Geographic. It wasn't about the money. It was about really me feeling good about it. And I felt like it was supposed to go on National Geographic. And so National Geographic picked it up, but of course they wanted to edit out the part where I talked about prayer and faith. But there was an editor there who said, no, you can't cut that out because it's part of his personal story. So it stayed in. It became the longest running, most requested, highest rated independent film in National Geographic history. And it was an independent film, but they continued to relicense it. And I said, why? Why do you keep licensing this film? And they said, because they've never had that much interest in an independent film before. So it ran for 9 years on National Geographic Channel. And then we went on to continue selling it as a video and a DVD and a Blu-ray at Mount St. Helens to visitors. Every year people would go there and they want to hear the story of what happened at Mount St. Helens, but they were mostly interested in what happened to the survivors and eyewitnesses because we have a hard time as humans to relate to something so big as a volcanic eruption, but we can relate to it from a human perspective. And that's what made my storytelling different, was I told the story from a human perspective. I found people that were eyewitnesses and survivors that were there on May 18th that survived miraculously, that had even a much more harrowing story than I did. And so I told their stories and we dramatized their stories because I wanted it to feel like you were watching a movie, but it was a docudrama about Mount St. Helens. And still to this day, you can watch my film. It's on our website and and you can watch the film. It's called The Fire Below Us, Remembering Mount St. Helens.
The Fire Below Us. Fantastic. So, Michael, our wives, right? Your wife basically said, hey, you're going to regret if you do not go through with this and you stick to this and you finish it up. You have no furniture in the house. How encouraging was it for you that in the midst of what looked like a lot of failure, because that's what it feels like when we don't have furniture in our homes, we don't know if a project's ever going to get completed, we don't know if it's just a pipe dream, that your wife, she said, you need to finish this thing. And she gave you an ultimatum and said, hey, once this baby's born, that project's got to be done. Have you two had a chance to reflect on that place of faith that you guys had to walk through as well, and how you were really rewarded for that?
Yeah. We've talked about it quite a bit about how, and I mean, I'm so blessed with my wife, and, for me, I married up. She has been, so supportive of all my crazy visions and dreams and things. And, we met when we met, she was a believer also. And she's always encouraged me in my visions and dreams, even when they don't make sense. And we've done a lot of things here where we had to make sacrifices to obey the things that we believe the Lord was calling us to do. Like there was a point in our life where we sensed that the Lord wanted us to make room for more children. And when we met, honestly, we were focused on our career. She was a journalism major and she wanted to do communications. And that's how we met, was that she wanted to learn about filmmaking and she came on as an intern. And I always say she was the best intern I ever had, so I had to marry her. Couldn't let her go. But then after we got married, I was convicted that God didn't call us together just to do projects together, but to have a family. And we started having kids, and they were such a blessing and so much fun. And they were portable. We could still travel and do the things that God was calling us to do. Things got a little bit more complicated when we had 3 children. And then when we had 4, it was even more difficult. And then she started staying home when we used to travel together on every project, every assignment, and doing things together, because that's how we met, working together. But then there was a point where we were having such a great time raising kids that we thought, why don't we add some more? But we were getting older, and we had the thought of, mostly my wife had the thought of adoption. So we looked into adoption, and we were going to adopt 1 or 2. And we had an opportunity to adopt 4 that became 5. And we ended up adopting this sibling set of 5 kids. So we added to our 4, and we raised 9 children then. And they were ages from about 1.5 to 8 years old when we adopted them. And that was about the same age range of our own children when we adopted them. And it was the greatest blessing of our lives to expand our family and to trust the Lord with that. I mean, we had a minivan that could seat 7. Now we needed a van that could seat 11, you know. So we've been stretched a lot over the years in our life and trusting the Lord, but he's always more than come through. You know, I had a friend tell me that whenever you stick your neck out, God steps in, and that's been so true in my entire life, you know, from the time that I said yes to following that inner feeling that I had that something was going to happen at Mount St. Helens that I had to be a part of. And I didn't even know. I did not know what was drawing me to Mount St. Helens. But today I look back at that and I know that it was God drawing me to Mount St. Helens, because he wanted to show me that he was personal and that he wanted to meet me on the mountain, on the fiery, smoky mountain, in the smoke and the flames, the ash. God was going to meet me there and change my life forever. And I was very humbled by that. And still to this day, you know, that marks my life.
Michael, what kind of advice would you give young filmmakers who want to do something similar to you? What would you tell them?
Well, for me, the most important thing is doing, you know, what the Lord wants you to do. That was what my mother told me, that encouraged me when I was really young. When I told her when I was 8 years old and she gave me her camera and let me play with it, she told me, I don't care what you do as long as you do what the Lord wants you to do. And I don't even think she understood what she was saying, but she told me she didn't care if I was a ditch digger or a garbage can collector, as long as I did it for the Lord. And somehow that stuck in me, even though I did not know how to walk that out. I did not even understand what she meant by that. But I think she knew that God had a higher purpose for her life. And I think that's the most important thing. But if you feel that, if you feel like that's your destiny, if that's something that you want to do, because I even laid that down after I was rescued from Mount St. Helens, I was so overwhelmed by what had happened. I was willing to lay down my own life, willing to lay down my career and go be a pastor if that's what God wanted me to be, or a missionary or whatever. But I sense the Lord saying, I want you to continue doing what you're doing, but just follow me in doing that. And that's what I sensed him saying to me after that. And I have never heard the audible voice of the Lord like I heard at Mount St. Helens, but I have to say that I've heard the Lord speak to me many times in my life. And he does speak to us, and he loves to speak to us. It's a two-way conversation. And we just have to be in a place of faith and a place of listening in order to hear. A lot of times we don't listen. We pray, but we don't listen. And I think listening is very much a part of prayer.
Mike, what projects are you working on today? What's keeping your focus now?
Yeah, I mean, back to your question about what to say to young filmmakers. I think if they do feel like God's calling them to be a filmmaker, to follow that and to have faith for it, because it takes a lot of faith to do something that you don't see or something you don't understand. And that's what I've had to do all my life is many times I don't see how it's going to turn out. I have to have faith, like moving forward at that desolation of Mount St. Helens, having faith that we're going to get out of there, having faith that at some point there's going to be a helicopter that's going to swoop in and rescue us. I can't say that I always had that faith. I didn't have it. I didn't even have peace about it until after I had that encounter with Jesus, and after I, had that assurance and to follow that. But I feel like following your dreams is important to do, and then having the faith to do that, and that God will show you those next steps, and finding good quality people with good character to help you with that process and to help mentor you. Because over the years, I've had a lot of people mentor me and a lot of professional opportunities for people mentoring me. And I still look for those opportunities too, to learn and grow. And now I feel like my life is about helping to mentor the next generation of filmmakers too. So that's kind of my word to young filmmakers is get a calling and an election. Make sure your vocation and your avocation come together, and then do it for the Lord. Do it for a higher purpose, because a lot of people do things for the wrong reason. And I think people are looking for meaning in life today, especially young people, especially Generation Z, are looking for meaning of life and meaningful life. There's nothing more meaningful than serving the Lord, in my opinion. And you can do that in a lot of different ways, and you can have a lot of fun doing it because it is fun. And it's scary too, because you're having to do things you don't see. And that's what faith is. Faith is believing in things we don't see.
So, Michael, I'm going to give it one more shot. What projects or creative work are you focusing on? What's life look like for you right now, Michael? I know that you got a lot of great stuff on. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, I've got two major projects that I'm focusing on right now, but over the years, I've focused a lot on understanding what happened at Mount St. Helens. So I did a lot of films on earth science, on volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis, which someday we're going to face that reality here in the Pacific Northwest. And I have a film that I did on that called Cascadia that's also on my website.
My
And
wife's from the United Kingdom, and for folks who that don't know this, we've got a plate out here that when it finally slips, and it slips every 300 to 500 years or so, and it hasn't slipped for 325 years. And when it does, it's going to be massive. My wife always says, "I'd prefer it if you just don't mention it." That's that's her thoughts on it, because what is it, Michael? It's like close to a 10 that we'll experience here in the Seattle
yeah.
area.
Yeah, well, in my film, when I finished it, it was the very first film telling the story of Cascadia. And because of the track record I had in producing films on earth science, PBS picked it up and it was distributed nationally. And only 2 weeks later, the Sumatra Indian Ocean earthquake tsunami happened, killing almost 300,000 people.
2004.
That's right. It was Boxing Day, 2004. And so PBS reran my film, and it became the highest rated film in PBS history. It outnumbered Nova programs.
Take that, Ken Burns. Take that, Ken Burns.
Because it was the timing of it, and this was something I felt like I was supposed to do. And it was another independent film that I didn't know why I was doing it, but I felt like I was to tell the story of Cascadia and help people prepare for earthquakes and tsunamis in the Northwest, because we had never heard of this before. In fact, I didn't hear about it before until I started investigating what happened at Mount St. Helens. Why did it erupt so big? Why did it catch us off guard? And so I met a volcanologist who was changing his focus from volcanology to seismology. And I asked him, why? What does seismology have to do with volcanoes? He said, well, because the process that fuels the Cascade volcanoes also triggers the largest earthquakes on Earth. And I said, you mean like in California? He goes, no, bigger than what happens in California. And I'm like, tell me more. So this began a several-year investigation on my part And nobody was telling this story yet. Only scientists were on the cutting edge of discovering this. It was only because of Mount St. Helens triggering them to understand the Cascadia subduction zone. Because previous to this, they thought that the Cascadia subduction zone was a relatively slippery fault line that was not going to be caught and trigger a magnitude 9 plus earthquake. So my film, in the course of doing the film, there was the Nisqually earthquake in 2001 that generated a big earthquake that caused, a couple of $1 billion worth of damage in the Seattle-Tacoma area. But that was a tiny fracture on the subduction zone. It was kind of a wake-up call, a tapping on our shoulder, reminding us that there's a Cascadia subduction zone that someday is going to big trigger this magnitude 9.2 or greater event. And so this film was released on PBS. It became the highest rated film. And then people were calling me saying, what's the use? We're all going to die. And that was not the point of the film. The point of the film was to show that this happens. And then I started doing a whole series of films on disaster preparedness. We did a film called Personal Survival Kit, and then we did a film on Business Survival Kit that won FEMA awards. And then the government started asking me to help them in the messaging of film. So we started doing a whole bunch of government contracts with Washington State military and others, helping people understand earthquake and volcano hazards that we have right here in our backyard in the Pacific Northwest. So that's what I did for several years. And then another area has been racial reconciliation. I did 2 biography documentaries on Alex Haley, and he told me that it was his dream to someday see racial healing. I'm like, what does that mean? How does that work? Even, because of all the civil rights and all the things that we had gone through in the 60s and 70s, and still to this day, these big issues that we face in our country. But I knew that God had a biblical response to that God had a solution for it. So I started producing films. There was a book written called Healing America's Wounds that addresses America's wounds of these issues from a biblical perspective, written by an outsider. And so that book really made sense to me. And so we turned the book into a film series. And then later we did one on slavery reconciliation called Yokes and Chains that tells the story of slavery reconciliation, because it's still the ramifications of that are still quite huge around the world, not just the United States, but especially in those places where, slavery made such a big impact, like in South America and the Caribbean, and of course in the United States. And so we did a film, decades ago on that also, racial reconciliation. And then more recently, we've been producing a series on the supernatural. So we're looking at supernatural and paranormal things, but it's from a narrative storytelling perspective, not documentary style, but in the style of more of like an ongoing television or streaming series. And it's targeting more of a younger teenage youth and some of the things that they experience with supernatural encounters, like maybe Bigfoot encounter or UFO or aliens, and trying to help them make sense of those type of things in this series. It's called Even the Darkness, and we have a website that has a trailer and more explanation about that. But stay tuned, because we're hoping to get that picked up by a major streaming service and then continue telling the stories. We're only telling the beginning of that and setting up the premise of that story to be an ongoing story, because it's a much bigger story and telling ultimately why, if there's a good God, why does evil exist? And that's what this film series kind of basically takes on, because I experienced, an overwhelming experience in my life at Mount St. Helens, and I had a supernatural experience with a supernatural God who we don't see, but I saw in a moment where there was a moment where the veil opened up and I saw, a physical manifestation of Jesus, and what he went through on the cross to Calvary was way far greater than anything I could go through in life here. So that's that series, Even the Darkness. And we have a website that you can learn more about that. And then I've been asked to do
that's called eventhedarkness.com.
Eventhedarkness.com. Yep. And we have strong Native American theme in that. And because we believe that the Native American people are supposed to be a big part of that awakening and that understanding of the supernatural realm. And they are, have many great stories for that. And we have a real heart for Native Americans. And that's part of our racial reconciliation work, has been addressing the genocide and the injustices done to Native Americans over the centuries, since, yeah. So that's been the focus of our work since Mount St. Helens.
So, Michael, if folks want to get a hold of you, you are an incredibly interesting, intriguing, dynamic individual. I'm excited to hear what you're going to be doing 20 years from now. How can they get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of you?
Yeah, just go to my website, globalnetproductions.com, globalnetproductions.com, and there's a contact form there. Just contact me through that. And that way you can learn more about what we do and watch any of our films there too on that website.
Fantastic. Michael, anything else you want to share before we close it up?
Just that don't wait for a volcano or, another disaster in your life to have a wake-up call, because God is real and he wants to show himself real to us. And for me, it took a erupting volcano to open my eyes that were blind to that, to the thing that really matters in life. And that is knowing the God who created us, the God who created this incredible planet, this amazing planet and the universe. He spoke it all into existence and made, what was nothing into something that's physical. But someday all of this is going to go away. And then faith is going to be, what is still there. And that faith, God gave us a way to know him, and he gave us a way to know him through Jesus. And that's what I learned in my lesson at Mount St. Helens. So that's what I hope people will want to learn that on their own without having to go through a wake-up call. Any kind of disaster, anything, a car accident or a divorce or a bad thing that happens in life, don't wait for that to turn to God, because he will answer your prayer. He will turn his heart towards you if you turn your heart towards him.
Michael, what a rich experience. Honestly, I feel like we were on Mount St. Helens with you. I feel to some degree like you were there yesterday. And so thank you for taking our imaginations right there with you. So really appreciate you, Michael. Really appreciate all the work that you've done. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and excited to see and connect with and be with someone who's truly, truly alive. So, Michael, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for doing that. I appreciate the wider lens that you give people in your conversations.
That's a wrap on the Wide Lens podcast. If today's episode broadened your view of history, please follow, rate, and review us. It makes a real difference. A heartfelt thanks to our guests for their story, and to Sergei Shadrin for providing the music. Know someone who's witnessed a pivotal moment? Drop us a line at ideas@widelenspodcast.com. Their story could be next. Until next time, keep looking at history through the wide lens.